Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 249, I chat with composer Richard Einhorn and film restoration expert Kevin Manbeck about the amazing story of the 1928 silent film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, how it was lost, found, and restored with brand new music. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.
It's time for Twit's annual audience survey, and we want to hear from you. Please visit twit.tv/survey and let us know what you think. It only takes a few minutes, and your anonymous feedback will help us make Twit even better. We thank you so much for your continued support. twit.tv/survey.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded March 26, 2015. Episode 249, Restoring the Passion of Joan of Arc. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of avsforum.com. This week's guest geeks are Richard Einhorn, a composer who is going to talk about some music that he wrote for a silent movie, and a returning guest to Home Theater Geeks. Hey, Richard, welcome back.
Hey, Scott, it's great to see you. Great to be here and to talk to everybody again. Wonderful show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's going to be very interesting today. Also with us is Kevin Manbeck, the CTO of MTI Film, a company that specializes in film restoration, among probably other things. Hey, Kevin, welcome.
Hi, great to see you. I'm really looking forward to this show.
Thank you. I am too. This is an unusual one for me because we're talking about a film from 1927 when it was made, 28 when it was released, and thought lost until it was discovered again. So we're going to get into that story. But before we do, I want to start by making sure that those of you who are watching the live stream at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv can post questions as we go along, and I'll pass along as many as I can. And if you do post a question, it would be good for you to use my screen name in the chat room, Scott Wilkinson, all one word, no dots or dashes or spaces, because that will make it show up in a different color on my screen, and it'll draw my eye more easily to it. Okay, so what we're talking about today is a silent film from which I guess was finished in 1928. It was shot mostly in 1927, according to the information I have, called The Passion of Joan of Arc. And it tells the story of the last hours, days maybe, of Joan of Arc's life. And I wanted to start, Richard, perhaps you can fill us in a little bit of the story, the actual historical tale, which we know from history, of Joan of Arc.
Sure. Happy to talk about Joan. Always. I truly love her and love this project. The Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in a tiny little town in the southeast of France called Domremy. And it's a village of about 250 people, and it looks basically about the same today as it did back in Joan's day. And in fact, her house and her church are still standing there.
Wow.
They're much restored, but they're national monuments. And when Joan was about 13 or so, she started to hear voices. When around the time she was 16 or so, the voices told her that they were the voices of angels and that she had been chosen by God to save France, which at that time was being overrun by the English and by allies of the English called the Burgundians, who were also French, but allied with the English. And so she did what any sensible 16-year-old girl would do back in France at that time, who heard the voices of angels. She went to the local count and said, "Give me an army, get me to the uncrowned king of France, the Dauphin, and I've got to go save France." So the count laughed at her, sent her back home. She ran away from home, went back to her, and became such a pest that he finally said, okay, if you want to go to the Dauphin and try to convince him, then let me give you 2 escorts and let you go. So off she went with 2 male companions. At that time, she cut her hair very short and dressed like a man, and arrived finally at the court of the uncrowned king, the Dauphin, and he somehow or another was convinced by Joan's manner to actually do what she asked, which was to put her at the head of an army, along with a bunch of other experienced generals, and her army went down to Orleans, which was a city sort of in the middle of France, which had been under siege by the English for over a year. And within 4 days, and Joan is credited as being the crucial turning point in the battle, within 4 days, Joan had lifted the siege of Orleans. Then she basically frog marched the Dauphin to the ritual anointing place, and he was anointed Charles VII, King of France. And for about a year afterwards, Joan won every battle that she was in. It's an unbelievable story, and it's so unbelievable that if there wasn't actual documentation, and quite a bit of it, nobody would believe it. Finally, after about a year or so in 1430, she was captured, she was betrayed by some allies of the English, captured, sold to the English, and then put on trial for her life. It was a court of the Inquisition. And this is where the movie, The Passion of Joan of Arc, begins. Joan of Arc's great military battles are behind her, victories are behind her. But what goes on in that courtroom is one of the most astonishing moments in all of Western history, the amount of bravery that she showed in this situation. And the film takes place during her trial and her death.
And what's most amazing about this film, one of the many amazing things about it, is that the film, at least the trial part, is based upon actual historical documents that survive to this day, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, there was meticulous transcripts taken during the trial, and those transcripts were probably taken in the vernacular, which was probably French, and then they were translated into Latin, and several copies were made of the entire Latin transcript, and surprisingly enough, at least one complete transcript or nearly complete transcript survives, as well as 2 others, I believe. And all of this documentation, it's very, very interesting. One of the documents actually has little notes, scribbles in the margins by the person who was transcribing, who says, "Good answer, Joan. Bad answer. Oh no." And so it's very, very interesting,
Wow.
and quite fascinating. Then 25 years after Joan died, her mother petitioned the Pope to have her restored to the church. She had been excommunicated by the Court of Inquisition. That gives nothing away because everybody knows that she died at the stake. But 25 years later, after she died, her mother did commission her to be restored to the church. And what happened was that they interviewed everybody who was still alive who knew Joan. And actually quite a few of the judges still were alive, as well as many of her childhood friends and friends of hers who fought with her during her battles. So we have all that documentation as well. And Joan to this day remains the only saint in the Catholic tradition who was first excommunicated and burned, and then became a saint. She's a kind of an extraordinary and very ambiguous and very she fits uncomfortably nowhere and comfortably everywhere. She's quite an amazing figure and endlessly fascinating. I mean, this project happened a long time ago, but I still think about her quite a bit.
Well, let's get to the movie then. And Kevin, can you tell us a bit about the movie itself, how it came to be, who was involved, what were the early days of the history of this movie?
Sure. Well, the movie was released, as you say, in 1928, and it had been quite controversial because of the subject matter and a lot of the dramatic effects in the movie. It had been edited many times, and felt that the original director's cut had been lost in a fire, and there was a second version that was approved by the director, also lost, and so all that remained were some very poor copies, and those copies were not the original intent because of the various editing that had happened.
Mm-hmm. We should say, by the way, that the director was a guy named Carl Theodor Dreyer, and the woman who played Joan of Arc was a woman named Renee Falconetti, who did an amazing job, as we'll see in a couple of clips. We're going to play a couple clips here, but I just wanted to make sure we got that piece of information in.
Sure. And this was her one and only film. She was a stage actress, and when she was finished with this role, went back to the stage. The movie was found, as you mentioned, in a mental institution in Oslo, and then I became involved probably in about 1998 or 99, part of the restoration effort that was ongoing with the Criterion Collection. Mm. And that summer, we restored 3 or 4 films for them, and Joan was one of them. Mm-hmm. We probably spent about 4 to 6 weeks doing the restoration, and we were developing our software at the same time. So this really was kind of a research project, a science mm-hmm. project to develop the software for restoration. At the same time, we were restoring a title.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into the restoration, and believe me, we're mm-hmm. going to get into the restoration, I want to spend a little more time on how it was lost and how it was found. I mean, that the way it was, the way in which it was found, or where it was found, is really quite amazing. As you said, the original director's cut was lost in a fire. The second version was also lost in a fire. And there were only these funky, re-edited versions that weren't really true to the original. And so it was basically presumed, the original was basically presumed lost for, 50 years more, until 1981. Now, tell us a little bit more about exactly where it was found and what those circumstances were.
In 1981, a copy was found in a janitor's closet in Oslo, in a mental institution. And
I just think that's so amazing.
Oh, it is amazing.
In a janitor's closet in a mental institution in Oslo, Norway, here is a complete copy, a complete print of this movie.
There's so many stories like this where these old films turn up in the most unlikely, unexpected ways.
Now, do you have any notion of how or why it ended up in Norway in relatively pristine condition?
Well, speculation is it was sent there for a viewing, and how it came to be in a mental institution is a little hard to guess, but somebody put it there for safekeeping and then forgot about it.
Until some 50, 60 years later,
somebody stumbled upon it and didn't know what it was. So whoever found it in the janitor's closet gave it to the Norwegian Film Board, and they held on to it for a few years before then they returned it to France.
And I saw in some of the materials of the movie, watching the DVD, that a guy named Maurice Druzy reestablished the French text, and then Cinématique Française reconstituted this French version, which is the one that you ended up working on. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the historical accuracy that Carl Dreyer made a great effort to be historically accurate. And one of the things that Richard pointed out to me is a scene where Joan is finally signing a confession. Mm-hmm. towards the end. And we have a clip of that called, or actually a photo called Signature. And if we pull that up, we will see something very interesting. And Richard, why don't you tell me if we can zoom in on the actual signature on this confession that Joan finally signs, her name. Actually, the priest helped her sign her name because she's pretty weak at this point. But there you see next to her name the cross. Richard, tell us what's the significance of that.
Sure. Let me just back up a little bit and say what this confession is. They were trying to, she was being tried by the court of the Inquisition, and they were trying to get her to confess that her voices were not the voices of angels, but that she had been deluded and was actually listening to the voices of devils, or was simply hallucinating. So what happened was, and this is all actually true, was that among other things, Joan fell extremely ill and was extremely weak, and they pressured her and threatened her with the instruments of torture, and also told her lies about her ability to be rescued. And finally, Joan broke down, realized that the only way that she could possibly save her life was to sign this confession. And she does so in the movie in a very, very moving scene. She's hauled out of this claustrophobic dungeon, and we suddenly go to a huge scene in a town square with thousands of people, and it's this huge burst of energy, and it clearly has disoriented Joan. And finally, she agrees to sign this confession, and she reaches for the pen. She grabs the pen. She takes the pen in her hand, and she clearly can't sign her own name. She doesn't know how to. She's illiterate. So a priest, a malevolent priest, holds her hand, and he actually writes her name for her. Then he releases her hand, and the moment he releases her hand, Joan scribbles that cross, which you see just to the right of her signature. And this is an example of Dreyer's genuinely deep, almost obsessive fascination with Joan, because in fact, Joan did sign letters with a cross. Joan actually signed quite a few letters, and some of them have survived. But some of the letters that she sent out, which was military correspondence during a war, was designed to fall into the hands of the enemy and mislead them. It was disinformation, and the only way the way that she was able to code that disinformation was to sign those letters that were to be disregarded by her allies with a cross. So basically what Joan is saying right here is, disregard this confession. I disavow this confession. It was done under duress. And Dreyer knew that and put it in the film, and it's really amazing. And in terms of my music, I realized that this was going on, that Dreyer had done this. And so what I have are voices that sing at this point that say to her, that recite a prayer saying, Lord, what I do for you and you only. So in other words, it's a way of kind of musically backing up the visual cue of Joan signing the cross.
It's fascinating. It also reminds me of a part of the Jewish calendar is called Kol Nidre, which basically means the idea of that particular moment in the Jewish calendar is, may all our vows be not upheld. This was at the time, again, of the Inquisition, when a lot of Jews were forced to convert to Christianity, Catholicism. But one time per year at the Jewish New Year, basically, they said, we absolve ourselves of those false vows that we took. So this reminds me kind of that, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, no, definitely, yeah.
Another thing I want to, here's a little clip I want to play, and I wanted to ask you if this really was historical. I suspect it was, that here we are near the end of the movie. Joan is about to be executed in public, And Carl Dreyer is depicting a carnival scene almost. Let's take a look at that. It's called carnival.mp4. We'll just play a little bit of it. And this includes some of Richard's music as well. Okay, very good. And then finally we have Joan's hair being picked up. Just for those of you who are only listening, that shot, that clip is alternates between Joan's hair being cut super short just for her execution, and the carnival that's happening outside. A couple of acrobats, a sword swallower, somebody juggling a wagon wheel on their nose. I mean, it's contortionist. Yeah, it's amazing. It's just amazing. So I just wanted to show that as what I think is a relatively accurate portrayal, because in those days, public executions were sort of carnival in nature. Am I right about that, Richard?
Yeah. Yes, you are right. They at least some were carnivals. Took place in carnivals. They were the entertainment. Now we have different kinds of entertainment. I mean, before we get appalled at it, we have to realize that we have kinds of entertainment now that would appall another era. For us, they're perfectly normal, but it's kind of one doesn't want to really judge them for these things, but only to the extent that capital punishment is wrong. Now, in terms of Joan's execution, as far as I know, there was no real. There's no account of there being a carnival at hers. However, there are a few details that we do know about her execution. One is that typically during an execution, as an act of mercy, because the people were burned at the stake, the executioner would snap the neck of the prisoner, and then the dead body would be burned. Very few people were burned at the stake alive. Unfortunately, the funeral pyre was built up too high for Joan, and the executioner couldn't reach up there. So Joan and couldn't snap her neck. So Joan literally did burn alive, and literally her last words, as they are in the film, are Jesus. The other thing that we know, which I thought was just simply a myth, was that Joan of Arc's heart was supposed to have survived, which of course is a very beautiful image, and then it was tossed into the Seine along with her ashes. But in fact, it turns out that there are some medical conditions such that if you cremate a corpse, the heart will actually remain solid in some way and survive. Wow. And apparently that may have happened with Joan. It's kind of eerie, and yeah, it's incredible. I mean, wherever in this project, everywhere that I looked, more amazing and more astonishing facts came out. The mental institution, the film being burned twice, and of course, Joan of Arc and fire.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. everywhere I went in this project, there was an extraordinary number of eerie coincidences and odd things happening. It's just really astonishing.
Now, Kevin, I want you to talk a little bit about some of the experimental techniques that were used in the creation of this film. Now, this was in the early days of cinema. It's a silent movie, and we're going to talk about how Richard composed music to it in a bit. But for now, I want to stick with the movie, and I have another clip to show, which is called Confession, and we're only going to look at about 1 minute of it. And at the 50-second mark, there's this amazing camera effect of panning overhead. And let's take a look at that. And then, Kevin, I'd like you to talk about that and some other things. Let's take a look first at this. Right here. That's it. That's it. Thank you very much. It's an incredible shot, really, especially for 1927. We also saw a little bit of the carnival atmosphere there with the stilt walker. But Kevin, tell us a little bit about some of the experimental techniques that were used in the making of this movie.
Yeah, so I think that Dreyer was absolutely experimenting. That this was early days of film, and so one thing that he experimented with quite a bit was close-ups, extreme close-ups, to really show the emotion and the reaction of the actors. And of course, close-ups have very unusual for an audience used to seeing stage actors. So I would say that was a real innovation. And close-ups have been very commonplace in later years. So that, another technique that I see him exploring and developing is that very opening shot, which you didn't show, but it's a great pan. It goes for quite a while, and it's expansive from left to right. There are
that's you mean at the very beginning of the movie?
The very beginning of the movie, there's a great pan.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't flip that one. No,
but the pan, action in the background, action in the foreground, action in the middle, very effective. It sets the whole stage, if you will, for the movie. And the pans have been used in movies ever since. So another great experiment that worked out very well for him, and other people picked up that technique. Another technique that he used a lot was shooting up, and we saw that here in this shot, where the crowd or the officials are walking across the stone pavement, and we see the pavement, and we're looking up at the actors. That's very common technique to this day. This one, the overhead pan, I was calling it a swing and a sway. Pan and scan, we see that all the time in modern movies. And we see lift and tilt, where you're kind of going from low angle to a higher angle, lift and tilt. This swing and sway, well, he tried it, and nobody really picked it up. It didn't seem like the rest of the world. It didn't resonate with a lot of people. Although in this case, it's kind of fun to watch. But not everything that was done in this movie was then used by others in later movies.
Well, again, experimentation means some things work, some things don't.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. No, but overall, I think it's amazing that the number of techniques that he did develop and how ubiquitous they've become.
Yeah. Loquacious in the chat room made an interesting point that I'm glad she brought up. She says the girl was courageous to have her hair cut off for the movie. If that's the case, I wonder. Now, I believe it was the case that she actually did have her hair cut off. And another interesting point was that she wore no makeup. I don't think anybody in this movie wore any makeup.
Right. Dreyer did not allow makeup because he wanted a more natural appearance of the people. And Dreyer was a very difficult director, I believe. I read that he would make Joan kneel for extended periods of time. Or Joan, I should say, Renee, the actress,
yeah.
make her kneel on hard, cold stone to the point of extreme discomfort, and then shoot the action where she had to blank her face so that we could see through her blank face her inner turmoil. And there are many shots where you absolutely can see her inner turmoil. And but yeah.
And that's probably because she was kneeling for so long. She's actually in physical pain. The actress.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Maybe that's why she didn't make another movie.
Really. Maybe so.
I think that's really the case. The story of the hair is that originally Lillian Gish was offered the part of Joan of Arc.
Oh,
and
that's
right. Yeah, she refused to cut her hair. So Dreyer looked around for another actress and finally located Renee Falconetti, who was a very famous stage actress. Kevin, that's absolutely right. In France at the time, and she agreed. According to Renee's daughter, who I met and interviewed, Renee agreed to have her hair cut, but she assumed that she would be able to, in her daughter's words, seduce Dreyer into not having her hair cut, but into wearing a wig. But she didn't realize with whom she was dealing with, and Dreyer insisted on it. And those tears that you see are very real. And apparently, right after that scene was shot, Falconetti had a nervous breakdown and was off the set for several days recuperating. And it was a terribly traumatic experience because she was one of the most glamorous and most famous actresses in all of France at the time.
Incredible. Well, Kevin, now it's time to talk a little bit about the restoration process. The movie was shot, it was lost, it was found in the janitor's closet in a Norwegian mental institution in 1981. It was a relatively, the print that was there was in relatively good condition, but there still were some issues. So tell us a bit about the restoration process. My first question in that regard is, at what resolution did you scan the film into the digital domain?
Right. Well, we did this work at 2K resolution. So this was for a high definition master, and of course DVD, the way that we're looking at it now, is a standard definition copy. And the process that we went through was it was such an old movie. There's essentially unlimited number of defects, and we had a finite amount of time to do the work. So we took a triage approach where we looked through the material and made lists of the worst defects and then moderate defects, and then basically organized our work process based on the severity of the damage. Tried to fix the most severe first, and then as time allows, do more.
Mm-hmm. We have some photos from there's a bonus feature on this DVD about the restoration process. It's very short, and I wasn't able to grab the video, but I was able to grab still shots. So we have, for example, restoration 1A and 1B. Okay, here's tell us what we're looking at here, Kevin.
So this would have been a splice mark. What you see, that horizontal line across her forehead, would have been a piece of tape where a splice occurred. Splicing is a mechanical process. Two pieces of film are laid end to end, and then tape and glue is used to fasten them together. And so that kind of cloudy material, the kind of the darker cloudy material is the glue, and then the edge of the tape is visible. And so we would have cleaned that up all digitally with our digital tools. So there's your result.
There's the cleaned up frame, and it's amazing how well that worked. Yeah, look at that. There it is before and after. I mean, it's remarkable. So number two.
Technically, when you're doing that, you want to look to see that her hair, where we did the repair, still looks very natural, and you have to see it in motion to really appreciate that the hair is fits with the rest of the shot. So at her forehead, the hair is obscured by the glue, and then it has been revealed.
Right. Quixton UK is asking, was this restoration done frame by frame? I suppose it had to be.
It is, with a combination of automation and manual intervention. So there's an artist who is supervising the process. Most of the work is done automatically, but with operator assistance.
Quixton in the UK also asks, was this film that was found in the closet at the Norwegian Mental Institution nitrate?
Yes.
Yes. And as a matter of fact, and the answer is, I believe, yes. And we have an example of that, actually. Or the reason that was done was nitrate is very flammable. It's a very delicate kind of material. And so it's prone to things like moisture. And we have an example of that. It's number 2, restoration number 2, A and B. So Kevin, tell us a little bit about this shot.
Yeah, so this is a very common type of a defect. It's a chemical stain or a water spot. Generally happens during the processing of the film. Chemicals are involved, and sometimes they splatter around. And so this would have been identified as being of a severe nature, and so then the operator would have instructed the software to restore this frame.
And there's the restoration. It's remarkable. It's really great.
So on this particular frame, if we go to the clean version, we can see that there's still some slight little vertical lines in there. Those we would have had to classify as being minor, just not enough time available to us to fully restore those fine little etchings there, because those are throughout the entire movie. Part of it, when you're watching, does give a appearance of something old, which it is. This wasn't made this year, and so some of that little bit of degradation gives you an appreciation for the age of the film, I think.
Another really amazing example is the next one, number 3, in which there are actually letters printed on the film. How did that happen?
Yeah, we see this so often, it's just unbelievable. These are most likely customs stamps. So this film went from France to Norway, and it was not the time of open borders, and so some customs official would have opened up the can, pulled out several feet of the film to look at it by eye, and then when he was satisfied that it was authentic, would have grabbed his permission stamp and stamped right on the film.
And this is actually near the end of the film, so it must have been stored tails out, as they say.
Tails out in that case, sure. Yeah, and we see this over and over again. It's just so comical. Sometimes we'll see a fingerprint or thumbprint right in the middle of the frame. Well, probably a clumsy customs officer was in the process of putting his stamp on there managed to make his own mark as well.
And then, of course, the restoration, it's gone. That's quite astonishing. Beatmaster in the chat room is asking, are the attempts of saving old film material telling us that we're better off with digital, or does film restoration show us how film still holds value for long-term preservation?
Yeah, that's a great subject of debate. And this film shot in 1928. Well, that's almost 100 years ago. We can get it out and put it on a projector and watch it, and we can see what's going on. If I had stored my home videos on a 5 1/4-inch floppy drive, I might have my drive. I wouldn't have any place to play it. There'd be no way to extract that information, and so that's really where that conversation or that debate leads. Is film, you can always look at it and you can see what's on it, whereas some digital is subject to the equipment that's used to play it.
On the other hand, film, particularly nitrate film like this is, degrades over time, and especially if it's not stored well. So, things have probably been lost by not having converted them to digital.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. That's what the race is on for a lot of these old movies, is to digitize them before they degrade to the point of being unusable.
Yeah, exactly.
And worry about long-term prospects later.
Yeah, just get it saved right now.
Just get it saved right now. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And here's one more example of that. Restoration number 4. Tell us about this one.
This one looks like probably mold. It could be a chemical stain. But another problem with a lot of these old films is kind of mold growth that can happen on the surface. Don't forget that film is really a gelatin. It's a kind of a mold grows very well on that gelatinous surface, and so we see this from quite a bit.
And then when we see the restoration, boom! Look at that.
Right, it becomes something that's not watchable to something that is very believable.
Absolutely. One other issue I want to talk about in terms of restoration, which is something you and I talked about offline, and Richard has something to say about this as well, so we'll bring him back in. But it's the issue of quote-unquote correcting anachronisms.
Right.
And the perfect example, the great example that you pointed me to was in the clip called Confession, which is a video clip, and at the 2-minute and 3-second mark, we're going to see quite the anachronism, or so we think.
There it is.
Right there. There it is. A guy wearing 20th century glasses. Now, Kevin, you talked to me about how you could have, in fact, gone in there and removed those glasses.
Right. Of course, we would always avoid doing something like that because it's part of the original film. It's really not up to us to go back and revisit what the director was trying to achieve, or what he was able to achieve, or what he managed to achieve. But it's an interesting question. Why did that happen? He was so careful. And
he was so careful in so many other ways.
So many ways, right?
Yeah. So, how did he let that? How did he let that slip?
Yeah. Or did he let it slip? Maybe it was.
Or Richard, did he let it slip? Yeah.
To me, when I was watching it, kind of brought the movie out of the past and into the present, just for that brief instant. Could this happen today? That's one way to look at it. Another possibility is you see a lot of art from this period of time. Renaissance artists would put a little homage of their tutor or their master down in the corner of a painting. So they might have a big mural of a religious theme, and then down in a corner is somebody completely out of the subject, and well, it turns out it was their tutor. And so maybe something like that's going on here. I don't know, but it's interesting to think about that.
It is. It's very interesting to think about it, and that is one possible explanation. Richard, you had another one, though.
Yeah, I'm like everybody else. I was astounded by that scene, and there are many shocks throughout the movie, things that are designed to shock you. And in fact, one critic has called this the greatest horror film ever made. And I've worked on many horror films, and I would have to agree. I mean, I've composed quite a few scores for them. I would have to agree that this is certainly the greatest horror film I've ever seen. It's much more than that, of course.
Yeah.
And this is one of the big shocks. So I mentioned it to one of the scholars that I was working with. I had several scholars that I consulted when I was doing the score, and I said, it's such a shame. It completely throws you out of the movie. And she faxed me back a woodcut, a copy of a woodcut of a monk wearing glasses that looked remarkably similar to the ones that are in there. I'm not suggesting that those are exactly period, but I have to say they looked awfully close to what I saw in that woodcut.
And that woodcut was from that period.
Yes, and glasses were, Scott, you and I were researching this just before the show. It turns out that the first pictorial representation of glasses precedes the Joan of Arc's life by about 75 years. So they did have glasses back then. Some of them looked a little strange, that's true, but the one that I saw in that woodcut looked remarkably close. I mean, there are other things in the movie that throw you out of the film. There's this horrific scene where Joan is, where there's bloodletting in the scene, and that actually turns out to be real. It's completely unexpected that Dreyer would show it to you, but he does. And there are other things as well.
By the way, we're not going to show you this scene.
No. Don't worry.
But this issue comes up quite a bit with old movies. For example, Wizard of Oz. Well, CGI today can make a much more dramatic and believable tornado. Should we go back and re-edit and put a better tornado in? I don't think so. No, that's not restoration. That would be something else.
Gotcha. A couple questions in the chat room. Yeah, it is actually. A couple questions in the chat room for Kevin. JJ to the 4884 asks, is this the same process that would be used to restore, say, Jaws?
We have restored using the same process, restoring new movies as well, or more recent movies.
Relatively new, yeah.
Yeah, relatively new, exactly.
Dr. Mack asks, how complicated is this restoration process, and how long does it take? How long did it take in this case?
In this case, we spent 4 or 6 weeks. We did a few titles during the course of a summer. It was very much an experimental project with the Criterion Collection, and so they were very supportive and giving us great feedback. And as I mentioned earlier, we were developing the software tools at the same time we were using them, and so the 4 to 6 weeks is what we were able to we were allotted to spend on this title.
CompuVision says he was going to make a joke about subtitles on dialogue cards, but then we see the dialogue cards. The question is, why didn't you do a version with English dialogue cards? And what you did do was put the English translation at the bottom of the dialogue card, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would have answered that, well, you wanted to retain the way the movie was made with the French dialogue cards.
Exactly, yeah. It's just another example of what should you do about the guy with the glasses.
Right.
We're trying to keep the title as close to the original as possible. That's what restoration is.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Richard, I'd like to spend a little time talking about the music. How did you first become aware of this movie, and how were you inspired to write an oratorio, basically, that is intended to be played along with the movie?
This project started because I wanted to do a big piece about religion. And then I saw this movie by sheer accident in the Museum of Modern Art Film Archive when I was researching a different project. And I was absolutely astounded. I mean, typically we get our masterpieces, spoon-fed to us. We see a great Spielberg film, or we see we hear a Beethoven string quartet, and we know we're going to see a masterpiece. But with Passion of Joan, it was completely unexpected, and it's an amazing and a shattering experience to see something like that. So basically, what I did was I dropped everything else I was doing, and I started to plan this piece. And the first thing that you learn about Joan is that she heard voices. So my piece would have voices. Now the question is, what do the voices sing? Well, again, that was pretty obvious. They would sing the voices of female medieval mystics from Joan of Arc's time and around then. So basically, that's how I started to make the decisions. I researched female medieval mystics. I read about 4,000 pages of these amazing writings, and started to put together.
I would guess that one of your primary sources would be Hildegard von Bingen.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned her. Hildegard, or Hildy, as some of us call her.
Those amongst her friends, yeah.
Including the scholars that I worked with. Hildegard was actually just coming into her own around the time she was just breaking away from the scholarly community and starting to come out into, the larger community of people who were interested in great writing. And so I encountered her. Encountering her writing was like encountering the movie itself. It was like suddenly, oh my God, here's a writer as great as Dante, and I never heard of her. And she's a woman, of course, and it turns out she was also a composer herself, although I never used any of her music in my score. So basically that's what I did. I never wanted to write a film score. That wasn't what I was interested in, although some people have said it's a film score. That's fine, and certainly enjoy it that way. That's fine with me. But my intention at the time was to try to create a piece that would run parallel with the film. Basically what I did was organize. I did use the film as an organizing principle. There were essentially roughly 15 scenes in the film. So I had 15 pieces of music that I wrote, and each piece of music has texts that are chosen to be appropriate to that scene and to comment on Joan of Arc's life in all sorts of interesting ways. Like the torture scene, for example, there's this really, really tense and exciting, if you will, torture scene. But my music, the words that are used are words where it's kind of where they talk about the erotic notion of what it's like. One of the texts goes, "I would long to see the last little bit of flesh that adheres to the nail of the cross." I mean, these horrible but also kind of sexually charged images, and I found that really, really fascinating. That concept fascinating, and I thought it would deepen the scene to write music that way. So that's basically what I did, and we premiered the piece in the middle of a blizzard, believe it or not, in upstate Massachusetts. But fortunately, all the tickets that were canceled, they were sold again, and we had a huge triumph. And within 2 weeks, Sony Classical had heard about this, and Columbia Artists had heard about it. So within 2 weeks, I had a record contract to record this piece, which shocked me no end. And I also had the beginnings of what turned out to be 2 national tours. So it became like a kind of a rather extraordinary that blizzard, which was the worst kind of lemon you could imagine, turned out to be rather sweet in the end.
And I must say that the DVD, which is currently available from Criterion, I got it on Amazon, features as there are many artists. I mean, there's a whole orchestra, there's a whole choir, and then there's the group Anonymous 4, which is composed of 4 women singers who specialize in medieval music. They also do other stuff too. And one of them happens to be a friend of ours, and I'm very happy about that. Tell us just a little bit about how Anonymous 4 got involved.
Sure, sure. I do want to back up, though, and just say one thing, which is that the Criterion DVD is truly, truly a remarkable document for Passion of Joan. And they were incredibly supportive of the music that I wrote and of the whole project. And Kevin, my God, you did an amazing job. And it's such a thrill to finally get a chance to just simply say that to you, at least virtually in person. And it's really extraordinary. Thank you very, very much for all the great work that you did. What happened was that when I was writing the score, I wanted a very specific sound for Joan herself. I found these beautiful letters by Joan of Arc that I knew that I had to set to music. The question was, what would Joan sound like? And I finally realized she would sound like, in my piece, she would sound just like this group that had just released their first record called Anonymous 4. And I had no idea who they were. I thought they were these 4 British women. And so I wrote the Joan music with them in mind, never thinking I'd ever have an opportunity to work with them. Then Sony suggested that we add special guest stars to them, and I immediately suggested Anonymous 4. It turns out that all 4 of them were living in New York. 3 of them were New Yorkers, in fact, and one of them was a displaced New Yorker, our friend Marcia Janensky, and we immediately met and we hit it off. We just loved each other, cracked thousands and thousands of incredibly bad jokes, and they agreed to do it. And I found out later that I was the first living composer that they'd ever worked with. I was the first composer they'd actually sung, whose music they'd sung, who hadn't been dead for 500 years. So that's kind of astonished about that, and I'm just absolutely delighted by their contribution, which is amazing. And we've remained very close friends since.
Yeah. By the way, Mike Heiss in the chat room is asking, what is the name of this piece that you wrote to accompany The Passion of Joan of Arc? And is it available as a CD?
The answer is, the name of the piece is Voices of Light. It is available as a CD. It's also available as a download from numerous services, including, of course, iTunes. It was beautifully recorded in Hilversum in the Netherlands by the Radio Netherlands Philharmonic, by Anonymous 4, by a wonderful conductor named Steve Mercurio. And it's a slightly different version is used in the DVD, but they're essentially the same. There's a little bit more music in the DVD, but almost all the score is available in the on the CD, which is still available from Sony Classical.
Mm-hmm. So we're just about out of time, but I do want to play one more clip, which is the torture scene that you alluded to there a moment ago. But I want to make sure everybody understands that this is 1927, and even though they did show bloodletting, that's not what we're going to see here. This scene of Joan in the torture chamber is really more psychological in the anticipation of torture. And it shows a number of things. First of all, some of the great camera work and quick cut editing of that Dreyer used, and also has some more of Richard's music that I would love to be listening to. So let's play the torture clip for just a few minutes here. John, if you could skip to the last, 30 seconds or so, just this is quite amazing. There we see the signature, and here are some scenes that are really starting to get intense. Oh, man. She collapses just from the expectation of watching this wheeled, horrible thing going faster and faster and faster, and the music gets faster and faster and more intense and more intense.
Right.
Just amazing. Just amazing. Well, I'm sure there's so much more to talk about, but we've come to the end of an hour. And so I want to thank you both very much for being here and exploring this amazing story of Joan of Arc and of the movie about Joan of Arc, made in the late 1920s and restored finally in the late 80s, early 90s. Let me start with you, Richard. Thank you so much for being here again. Thanks for the great music and the wonderful discussion about all these different aspects.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Scott. Terrific. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. And Kevin Manbeck, of course, from MTI Film, who was involved in the restoration project. Thank you so much for revealing so much about what went into it. I'm sure it gave our audience a lot of insight into what goes on there. One point quickly I wanted to make is that you, in the film, it says there were over 20,000 individual blemishes that got removed. That's remarkable.
Right. Yep. Well, thanks very much. It was a real pleasure talking to both you and Richard. And yeah, really great topic and a lot of fun today.
Good. Stick around. I got a little bit more to say, but then we'd have one little piece of housekeeping to do after we're done. But I want to make sure that everybody knows that if you want to find out more about Richard Einhorn's music, you can go to his website, Richard Einhorn. That's Richard spelled normally. EINHORN.com. And if you want to find out more about MTI Film and their work that Kevin helps do there as the Chief Technical Officer, that is mtifilm.com. You can always find me, of course, online at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott and at avsforum. You can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here at twit.tv/htg, and also on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twit Home Theater Geeks. Now, don't forget, starting this month, we are now live at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, half an hour earlier than our previous start time. So be sure to make a note of that. If you want to join us live at live.twit.tv, we would sure love to see you for that. Next week, I will be answering questions from the chat room. So be sure to get your questions ready about anything home theater or audio video related, and I will be happy to expound upon that at length. So I do hope you will join me for that. Should be a great time. Until then, geek out.